So let's move into our AFL tips for round 18. There's a lot of games, 50-50 games this week, and we'll start off on Friday night with our tip. Collingwood against Geelong, I've gone Collingwood. Saturday afternoon, I've gone Hawthorn over the Dockers, the Swans over North Melbourne. Saturday evening, I've gone Carlton over the Western Bulldogs. And Saturday night, I've gone the Crows over St Kilda and Essendon over Melbourne. Moving on to Sunday, I've gone the Gold Coast Suns over Port Adelaide, the Giants over Richmond, and then the final game of round 18, I've gone the Lions over the West Coast Eagles. What have you gone with this week?
So Friday night, I've went Geelong over Collingwood. Saturday afternoon, I've went Hawthorn over Freo, Sydney over North Melbourne, Carlton over the Bulldogs. Saturday night, I've went the Crows over the Saints and Essendon over Melbourne. For Sunday, I've went Port Adelaide over the Gold Coast, Giants over Richmond, and to finish the round, Brisbane over the Eagles.
Alright, so we do have a couple of different games this week. So we'll start off on Friday night, probably the biggest game of the round, if I'm being honest. Collingwood against Geelong. So Geelong the last couple of weeks have regained some form. The Pies have been a little bit off. They've obviously been off a lot on their defensive side. Why have you gone Geelong?
I think they're playing a lot better than what they were. I think the restructure of their midfield, Dangerfield coming back, Stewart heading into the midfield a bit, Sam DeConing in the ruck.
With Mark Blitzars.
Yeah, with Mark Blitzars. It seems like Jeremy Cameron got into a bit of form last week. Yeah, he kicked 4 and 1 on the full, but he could have kicked 9. I think he's in great form.
Yeah.
And Collingwood, I think they've just got a bit too many injuries at the moment.
I think Collingwood right now are just a bit off, and I think that the Cats, look, they beat Hawthorn, which were in a form team, but they played them down in Geelong, and I don't think Hawthorn have played down there in like 20 years, so none of those, I think we looked at it when we were on the stream, that Hawthorn had maybe 4 or 5 players that have ever played down there,
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's a very different ground, and a lot of players, if you don't know how to play down there, you don't have much experience down there, it's a very hard ground to play. So I think that Hawthorn, I think it was a pretty easy win in the end for Geelong. I don't think they had much of a contest. And I feel like Collingwood, they're going to be a bit called out this week, and I think they will respond. I think this will be a very close game, but I think the Collingwood's midfield is going to hold up here. I think that they've got a very good ruckman in Darcy Cameron. Nick Dacos, he had a down week last week. I feel like he'll be back. Scotty Pendlebury being back last week was good for them as well. Jack Crisp had a really good start to that game. So I think that Collingwood do have the midfield depth that's going to question Geelong. And I think that's where last week Hawthorn had a little bit of a struggle. All of their midfielders, bar maybe Warple, were very well held. So I think that Collingwood's midfield, I think there's a lot of other avenues to get them through the stoppages and get them forward. So I think that's where they're going to be able to get it to be one. And I don't think Geelong the last couple of weeks have really been challenged in their defence. So that's where I'm kind of looking at it on that front. After that, let's take a look at the Western Bulldogs v Carlton game. So that's an interesting one. What happened to both of them last week? So obviously they played a shootout, Carlton against the Giants, and the Bulldogs didn't show up in the first half against Port Adelaide. The Western Bulldogs are a response team. That's what I think that's pretty well known. But Carlton, they were not. No one expected them to lose to the Giants last week.
Yeah.
So I think we both picked Carlton for it. Do you think the Bulldogs have a bit of a chance here, or do you think with the response, or do you think Carlton are going to be raring to go after a poor loss?
I think that, sure, the Bulldogs could win that. It could win, but I just think the fact is that last week against Port Adelaide, they just let Butters and Rosie just roam the first quarter to get so many possessions in the game in the first quarter. I think they both had plus 15.
Yeah.
So they just let them roam, and they just didn't show any pressure. And against Carlton, they have to be able to match it with their midfield, or they just got no hope.
Yeah, well, I think that Bontempelli, despite him having a huge last quarter, he was pretty well held last week against Port.
Yeah.
So I think it's another talking point as well. Looking at Carlton, though, even though they lost, Paddy Cripps still had a blinder. They still had quite a few players who played really well. At the end of the day, the Giants just kicked more goals. Yeah. That's really all that happened. And, I mean, even Carlton players had filled their boots a little bit as well. I don't think they'll have that big of a challenge on the offensive front from the Bulldogs. And I think that Carlton's midfield's definitely going to want to respond from last week as well. And their defence, I think Carlton is going to, want to make a stand a little bit because they conceded 18 goals. And they want to win a grand final this year. They can't do that on the regular. Another game as well is Essendon up against Melbourne. So Melbourne had a pretty big win last week. Obviously, it was against the West Coast. That's not a massive win.
Yeah.
But a couple of players did get into a bit of form. And I think without Max Gawn, is there any chance really for Melbourne if he is out?
No, I think that's the one reason that I'm not tipping them this week is that Max Gawn is likely to be out. I just don't think they can win that midfield battle without Petrarca and Gawn in that team.
Yeah, well, I mean, the in would probably be, I think it's Tom Fullerton who would come in. I'm not too sure. I haven't looked at their VFL team, but I'm assuming he's fine and he'll come in. He was obviously picked up from the Lions last year. So, but looking at Essendon, though, it was a bit of a surprise. I thought that they were going to be not well beaten last week, but against Collingwood, they haven't proved themselves against the top 8 side so far.
Yeah.
So they kind of proved themselves against the top 8 side. And I guess it was against Collingwood, who haven't been in the greatest of form. But maybe that's just the monkey that comes off the back. Melbourne aren't in the 8, so that's not something that's an issue. But Melbourne, on their day, can still beat majority of teams. Being able to strangle them with their defence.
Yeah.
So Essendon, there's still such a question mark for me. I still think they'll win this week because I think they're strong enough. I think that Zach Merritt's in massive form. I think Zach Merritt's had a massive year, career best year almost. And it may not even be on the stat sheet, but his influence on games has proven so good. It'd be interesting to see if Melbourne do go to him, but they don't really use a tagger per se, so I don't think they'll really do that. And I just don't think Melbourne have the form or the midfield depth to really control the likes of Zach Merritt, who he gets it inside their 50 enough, they'll be able to kick a winning score. Essendon, which I think on the other side, I don't think Melbourne do have that sort of those attributes up on their side.
No.
And the last game I wanted to take a look at was the Port Adelaide v Gold Coast game. So we have 2 different ones this week. I've gone the Gold Coast, you've gone Port Adelaide. Now, I think I know where I'm sitting on this. Why have you gone Port? Because you've been very questionable on picking them this year.
Yeah, well, I think if Jared Witts is out and Took Miller is out, I don't think they have the midfield depth to win the contest.
So you think Port Adelaide are going to be the first team to beat Gold Coast in the Gold Coast?
Yeah, and let's be honest, Port Adelaide, ever since they lost that first game historically against them, we've won every other single encounter.
So they're the bunny team, are they?
Yeah, well, we've got the best record out of any team against
the Gold Coast.
Yeah, so that's.
You do always have the record of being the first team.
Yeah, well,
too, though.
Yeah.
So no one remembers the record of the.
Yeah, no one remembers that one, but every Port supporter does because we don't have. Yeah, because we get hounded against that we were first team to lose to them.
Well, you're also the team who's had the biggest smashing in a grand final too.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that Port Adelaide fans care about when they're watching a grand final. Yeah. It's not about the winner; it's about how much the loser can lose by.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that midfield, if they don't have Jared Witts and Took Miller, it's going to be harder for them to win.
Looking on the Gold Coast, I just think Port Adelaide, they've had a couple of good wins. I think it was a very big shock to me that they beat the Bulldogs. But I think the Gold Coast at home, they're going back there this week. They'll have a bit of scrutiny on them. Damien Hardwick's press conference, he obviously gave him a big roost on there. So I think the Gold Coast will respond. And I think the Port Adelaide, it's a little bit of a false dawn in my opinion. I don't think they're back to what they are, they're their best or anything. I think the Bulldogs let them go in the first half and Port Adelaide just took advantage of it. So I think it's a bit of a false dawn on the Port Adelaide front. And on the Gold Coast, I think they'll respond because I think that they need to. Because if they don't, I feel like a couple of ears could be clipped on the way out from Damien Hardwick's presser in the week after. But of course, with that being said, guys, let's take a look at our AFL tipping comp. Of course, it is still Brendan who leads on top with 102 tips. He's 3 tips clear now on top of the ladder. He was in the chat on the stream last week. He picked North Melbourne, so that was a big one for him. That got him another tip in front. Looking at it right now, I am in 7th spot. I only got 4 tips last week. That was so embarrassing. How many? Oh, you only got 4 as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I got 93, so I'm 9 tips behind first. You are 9, 10, 11 tips behind. And bottom spot is Kirk G as well as Brooke K, who are both on 89. They got 1 tip better than us. That's how embarrassing we had about last week, for a week we had. Looking at it right now, really the only one who's going to be able to challenge Brendan this year is Paul. So Paul was on 99 tips. He is 3 tips behind though. So still a huge gap. And the gap between first and third right now is 8 tips. So Brendan is, if he loses it from here, it's the ultimate choke.
Yeah.
He can't lose it from here. There's, 6 rounds to go? 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4? 6 rounds to go? 7 rounds to go. 7 rounds to go. All right, there's a bit of a chance here.
Yeah.
But at this point, he can't drop from second. If he dropped from second...
You wouldn't think.
No way. There's no hope. So anyway, that's basically all we have for the AFL tipping, guys.